Okay, we can get started. Thanks a lot, everybody, for joining. This is the second session that we're doing. So last time when we met, our goal there was to basically install OpenIAM on an Ubuntu instance using Docker. So we're going to build on what we did last time, and our goal today is going to kind of focus on what I would call basically application onboarding, right? So these are going to be some fundamental steps that we take today to get to the point where we can basically start to automatically provision and deprovision. So today we'll be focusing on connecting OpenIAM to an Active Directory, which is a very common target for many of our customers. I think I would say a majority of our customers have Active Directory or Azure AD somewhere within their environment. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And the idea is that we will focus on installing and integrating OpenIAM with AD. We'll pull in the existing the group memberships which are there, followed by the users which are in AD already, kind of build a full profile within OpenIAM, right? And then the idea is that we create a foundation with that. And then the next session that we do on Thursday, we will focus on how we can basically, we can automatically, not automatically, how we can provision and deprovision users in AD. And the following week, we'll tie it all together by showing how we can implement end-to-end joiners and movers in leavers use cases, right? The normal things that we want to be able to automate in the lifecycle management. So basically, we're going to build up towards that, piece by piece, getting to that goal. Okay. Our session today is going to be broken up in two parts, right? There's going to be just like we did last time. We'll do some part which is kind of background information, and then we'll kind of focus on how we can actually do it. So, just taking a step back in terms of why we're doing this, right? And again, it's like we're trying to build a foundation. So when we onboard a new application, and onboarding really means about basically adding an application into OpenIAM, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to gain visibility of what a person has access to today, and then the second step, we want to be able to automate this process, right? And you can see from our diagram that the end goal is that we may have one or more authoritative sources, and then we have one or more target systems, right? Target systems are the applications that we want to be able to, write user and other, information into to be able to create users, modify them, delete them, right? So, so again, when we go a little bit deeper into this, when we're looking at, at the onboarding process, the first part really, is about being able to register the application in OpenIAM. And we'll go through, the steps which are required there, right? And then we will, run two processes. We'll bring in the group memberships, which are in AD. We can go deeper if we wanted to. We can bring like the computer objects as well and shared folders. But our goal today is going to be on the group memberships because conceptually they're the same. And then we're going to focus on importing the users as well. And when we look at the onboarding, like I said, we want to create a view of what each person can do in one of these applications, right? And so part of our audit objectives down the road is to be able to have control over who's got access to what, when did they get it, and why did they get it, right? So this is giving us that first view of what people can do, at a point in time. And the processes that we set up here will also show that how we can run them on a regular basis, like on a nightly basis, if we wanted to keep OpenIAM current. So this is even without getting into the whole user lifecycle part. If we just wanted to have a foundation where we wanted to run, say, an access certification, that we could use these steps to be able to build that foundation for them, right? And similarly, like that same foundation is going to be used to create the service catalog, right? The service catalog is in the self-service portal, which we'll look at a little bit down the road, and where we can have some request approval workflows. And then, as I said, a couple of minutes ago, that we can implement our user lifecycle management. So this is basically an essential step, in doing anything that's on the identity governance side to be able to start with this. Okay. And The other part is that there are a number of ways that we can do this. So we have the admin UI, which is kind of what we're going to be looking at today because it's more interactive. But some of our customers, they have hundreds of applications that they want to load. Some are things that we have connectors for. Some of them, there aren't any connectors for. So they can use even a CSV file to be able to bulk upload, the application. So they're not really dependent on doing this, manually, which, if there's that many applications, it can be extremely tedious. There's a third scenario where you can use a REST API to be able to create these objects. And I know at least a few of our customers have integrated OpenIAM into their DevOps process where they're creating new VMs and destroying them. And basically they're registering these applications in OpenIAM using our REST API, right? So it can become, a part of your DevOps process if you wanted to kind of look at it that way, right? Especially when you have, hundreds or thousands of, Linux and Windows servers out there, which you need to manage. So if we look at this next slide, this is kind of basically taking a little bit of a deeper look in terms of how OpenIAM does things internally. And it's kind of breaking out the larger diagram that we had earlier, which was showing the various services that are there that make up the stack. So if you want to look at this box here that says OpenIAM services, this is really like your Linux box where OpenIAM's installed. And here I've kind of separated out the OpenIAM database, but you don't really need to. I mean, this is all running on the same box, right? And so what we have here is, so on this box, in addition to all these services, are a group of connectors, right? So by default, the LDAP connector is already installed on this. And as we go today, I'll show you how we can turn on additional connectors as well. So these connectors, which are already on the OpenIAM host, we internally refer to them as basically local connectors, right? Because they're part of that core deployment. We can also deploy connectors on a separate connector VM. So, and this is especially true for what we're going to be doing today. And there are many reasons why you may want to do this. So first of all, if you're working with the Microsoft world, all of our connectors for the Microsoft world are written in .NET and PowerShell. So because it's .NET and PowerShell, they can't run on basically the Linux box, which OpenIAM is running on, right? So for that, you need a separate VM. So these are basically remote connectors because they're running on a separate VM. And that VM does not have to be located right next to the OpenIAM host. In our deployment today, they're running in the same data center, but that's just because we're going to try to do a demo here. In practice, there's a very common use case where we need to do this, and which is that consider that you have OpenIAM and your target systems in separate subnets, separate networks even. So think about deploying OpenIAM in a cloud environment like in an AWS, Azure, or Google, and then you have all these on-prem systems. So what we do there is we have a connector VM, maybe one for Windows, one for Linux, deploy that on-prem, and we have a secure communication between the OpenIAM host, which is in the cloud, and with this VM, which is on-prem, and all of your connectors can be deployed on there. As long as they're able to talk to each other through RabbitMQ, the communication will work, right? And so this gives us a huge amount of flexibility in the terms of how we can adapt to various deployment architectures. Okay. So here we have our deployment today is going to be quite simple. We're going to have a Linux box like we did last time where we installed OpenIAM. And then we have a Windows VM, which is running Windows Server 2019, and it's going to have the AD connector on it, right? And then that connector can talk to Active Directory, right? But so there's no direct path from the OpenIAM host to these applications. So again, it's also easier to secure this architecture because you only have this one or two VMs which are running, in your on-prem environment. And you just need to be able to protect the communication into this. The rest of this is going to be internal communication, which you can secure. Okay. One thing I didn't add earlier on is I like to keep these things interactive. So if there's questions that come up, feel free to ask, and I will try to do my best to answer them. If I'm not able to answer them, I will get the details for you. So here's the first question. Will you be migrating your AD connectors to .NET core and PowerShell core? That's a good question. So there's actually an effort going on right now to move the AD connector in particular to this type of a model because there's a significant performance boost that we're able to achieve. And so today the PowerShell connectors are incredibly flexible, and we've shown that for years that with that PowerShell model being external to the connector, we can very quickly adapt it to various scenarios. But there are also some customer environments which have a very significant amount of volume. And for that, we need a little bit of extra speed. And this kind of a move does give that I think we're seeing almost a 9 to 10 times boost in performance and kind of moving over to this model. So we will move over to it. We will still continue to keep the PowerShell architecture because of the flexibility there, and they're mature. But yes, they will be moving over to this world. Okay. Thanks for that question. Okay, so before we go deeper, there's some terms that we use on the OpenIAM side which may be obvious for some people, may not be obvious. So let's maybe talk a little bit about the terminology, and this way we kind of create a little bit of a foundation as we go forward. So the first we'll be using the word connector a lot, right? So connector refers to the piece of software which allows you to talk to a type of system. Okay. So for example, if we look at the Active Directory connector, right? It's talking to all instances of Active Directory. Same thing with our LDAP connector, our AWS, so on and so forth, right? A managed system represents a configuration to talk to one instance of that application, right? So if we have, say, 3 different AD domains, which we do in several of our customers, then you can have one PowerShell connector, which is going to point to all 3, which is basically going to use 3 different managed system configurations, and it can point to each one of them. Same thing if you had, say, multiple Salesforce.com tenants, you could have one Salesforce.com connector, which will point to all of your the different tenants that you have, right? So it's a one-to-many relationship between a connector and a managed system. Okay. Synchronization is another word that we'll be using today, and synchronization is how we do several things. So in the context of today's session, we're going to be using it to import data from our target systems. We'll bring in data from Active Directory, your users and your groups, and bring them into OpenIAM. So we use that for synchronization. Synchronization is a one-way process. And I draw that distinction because we have another process which is called reconciliation, which we use to kind of compare 2 systems together. So it's basically doing a matching of data in 2 systems and detecting where there are differences and then taking some action, right? The other place that we use synchronization is also to bulk load data. So if we have data in CSV files, again, it's synchronization that we use to be able to bring that data into OpenIAM. And the third place that we use it is to automate the user lifecycle management. So synchronization is how we integrate with our HR source or whatever your source system is, and to be able to detect that data, manipulate it, and then trigger off some downstream system, processing, right? So one process used in many different ways, but it's a really core part of the activities that we do within the IGA side of this. Okay. So let's shift gears now. Let's focus a little bit more on connecting to Active Directory, right? So a couple of things that I had to do first. So if you remember last time, we installed OpenIAM using Docker. And we said last time that Docker compose files, the YAML files, are where we keep a lot of our configuration about how these containers behave. So one of those containers is a container for RabbitMQ. And that RabbitMQ container, when we are communicating with these remote connectors as we are today, we need to be able to make sure that port 5672, which is the default port that RabbitMQ is listening to, is open. And by default, it's actually closed, right? So we need to make sure that that port is open, and we'll talk a second about how we do that. The second part is we need to install the AD connector on the Windows box. Then we need to register it with OpenIAM. And then the last part is to configure a managed system, right? So these are the steps that we need to do to kind of to basically onboard the Active Directory connector and integration, right? So let's take a look at the first step. And there's a typo in here already. I see one. So first thing is that we need to open up 5672, and that's in the Docker Compose YAML file. And these are in that 3.2 directory. And we'll do this in a second. We'll kind of show you where these things are. And when you uncomment those lines that are referring to that port, you should then stop OpenIAM and then restart it, so that on that restart, it will reprocess the setup file and run these YAML files so that these port changes take into account. The second thing is you also need to make sure that the port is open on your host machine and on your Windows machine, right? So, when I was preparing for this yesterday, I found out that on my Linux box that these ports were closed, so needed to basically open them up, right? And ignore the typo. It's not 5673, it's 5672. That should be the port that we open up, right? So in this case, let's, so we'll be doing that in a second, and then let's do this part first, and then we can come back to the next part. Okay, so I've already SSH into my Linux box. Let me just make this view a little bit bigger so it's easier to use. Okay. So if I look at this file, this is my directory where the YAML files are kept, right? So if I now if I change directories to So I'm going to go into the infrastructure, and then I'm going to look for the RabbitMQ directory. And if I open this up, there should just be one YAML file, right? So I can open that up by saying nano and Docker Compose. Right? And right here, you'll see a comment that says, if you're using a remote connector, you should uncomment the section. So I've already done this so that, make sure that I don't have a disaster for today and, so that we're prepared. So these were marked out like this, earlier. And so I basically uncommented these and saved them, right? So you need to open up the port section and the 5672. And this is really the only change that we need to make here, but we need to, basically rerun RabbitMQ, right? Rerun the OpenIAM so that these changes take into effect. Okay, and then we can, go from there. No, I don't need to make any changes because I've already done this. And then the second part is, once this is done, we can then look at the AD part of this. So, and I already took care of the firewall changes and those things earlier as well, right? So when we look at install the AD connector, this is really a pretty easy step. So there's a Windows installer, as you would expect, and you basically just double click on it and it will go ahead and start the installation process, right? And when it's installing this, it's going to be doing two things. It's going to be installing the SQL Server Compact Edition. And this is a really lightweight version of SQL Server, which is meant for like embedded systems. And we use this as a centralized tool for all of the PowerShell connectors to do their logging, so that it becomes pretty easy to, from a troubleshooting standpoint, that we can, and we'll take a look at this as well. Right, and then we'll we'll look at the PowerShell connector itself. We'll install that, create the foundation for it. You'll register the connector, so you'll be able to see it in your Windows, in the control panel. And then during the installation process, it's going to ask you a few questions. It's going to ask you things like, about the RabbitMQ host, and this throws some people off sometimes. So the RabbitMQ host is really, it's where OpenIAM is been installed, right? So unless you have moved RabbitMQ, the container, into a separate place, the host details for that should be the same thing as your OpenIAM host, IP address or your host name. The username and password, these are defined in the environment.sh and they were loaded into the vault. But these are your credentials, for RabbitMQ. And so unless you changed it, you can use the default values in our documentation to be able to do this. I would recommend, though, for our production deployment that we change those because there's just no reason to leave that information as defaults. And then there's a reference to a queue. The queue is the RabbitMQ queue that we're going to be using. This is the path that how messages will flow from the OpenIAM service to basically OpenIAM, right, and into the connector. And then the last part is basically the port, and the port what we discussed. This is we open up the firewall, but this is port 5672, right? So let's go ahead and do this part. So I've already logged into my Windows machine and got this up and running. And I put the AD connector. So this is downloaded from downloads.openiam.com, and we'll share the link for this. But basically, you bring down your connector. I did this earlier already, and it says go ahead and run, and it's going to skip the SQL Server Compact Edition because I did this once already, and that SQL Server is already there. And so it's asking where do I want to put it. This is our default path, right? It's under C connectors, but you can change this to whatever you want it to be. And come in here, and so here we start, entering some details, right? So our host, right? This is going to be right. This is where it is. Now this queue I'll show you where this is on the OpenIAM interface in a second, but this must align with the queue definition of the connector on the OpenIAM registration. If these are somehow different, then they will not talk to each other, right? So this is really well, you need to, and the username and password, this is defaulting to what's already in our documentation as a default username and password. But again, if you change it, you need to change this as well, right? And now we can test the connection. The connection was successful. This means that the connector is able to talk to RabbitMQ. So we're good here, right? And it's going to go ahead and copy, the files that it needs to. So take literally a minute, and we're done. So that's the difficulty of installing the AD connector. And in your Windows machine, if you go to C connectors, you see AD directory, and you'll see some various files there. A couple of files that are going to be of interest to you. So connector.config. Let's open this up. So this is the configuration that the AD connector is listening. You'll see that the things like the username and the password have been kind of hashed out, so that the file is a little bit more secure. But this is where we're defining basically where does RabbitMQ live. And so if you were to move things around, you need to remember to change this file and reflect these changes. There's also something here which we can keep in mind for, in the future, which is this value here is save requests enabled. This is going to be helpful if you want to be able to troubleshoot, and this puts the connector into a simulation mode. So instead of talking to AD directly or carrying out operations, it will dump all the values into a JSON file, which you can then use for basically, to troubleshoot, make sure your connectors are working okay before we kind of play with things. It's helpful sometimes when we're in a production setting and there's a problem that we need to troubleshoot, right? Okay, so this part's okay. There is another file here, which is the log.db. This is your database file, which that SQL Server Compact Edition is going to be using to put all the logs into. And we'll get to this in a second. Okay, so let's go to our instance that we set up last time. So I'm going to log in. Okay, so first thing we need to do is register the connector, right? So we're going to come here, we're going to provision, we're going to go to connectors, and AD PowerShell is our first one here, right? And this really should be fine as it is as a default, right? So this is this value, the remote connector 1. So we saw this in our connector install. This was the queue, right? And So if we were to change this, we need to, change this on both sides. Otherwise, we'll have a mismatch. Okay. And I'm going to save this again anyway. And then the next thing I'm going to do is going to go to the manage systems, and we're going to define the configuration here. And so this is picking up, okay. So let's go and drop these values in, right? So first is we need to put in our AD host. So this host URL here that we're going to put in, this is the host name of your Active Directory. It's not your, it's not even your connector, right? The connector is talking to OpenIAM using the message bus. So we don't need to define where the connector is located. That part's already been established between during the connector installation. So this is the information that we're going to pass to the connector during a request. So part of this is also that the connector does not need to live on the AD domain controller. In fact, we recommend that you don't put it on the AD domain controller, just for basically security reasons. Keep that domain controller, safe and isolated, right? So this URL that you're passing in is going to, now we don't need to define a port here because by default, the PowerShell connectors are going to be using WinRM to be able to communicate with Active Directory. Okay, so we do this, and then we have our AD account over here, and so this is the service account. So I'm using the admin account because just out of convenience, but you really should not use your administrator account. You should create a service account for Active Directory, and in our documentation, there are rights that we define that the connector service account should have, right? And this will give you better traceability also on the AD logs of what the connector is doing, right? So you can be able to track down. So really, and it's fine in a test setting like this or a POC, but never in a production setting should you use the admin account to be able to do this. Okay. The second part is the field that you're going to see here is the object primary key for the user. So this is the field in AD in your attributes, which is going to be so there's a question about what permission should the service account have. This is actually defined in our documentation, and we'll send you the link to where they are. It's really a little bit more than I can recite off the top of my head, but it's pretty clearly laid out over there, and we'll send it over to you. Okay. So so in this case we're going to use SAM account name, but it's really any unique value that you would have within Active Directory. So let's go ahead and we'll drop in there, and base DN and for the user and the search base DN, these two values are basically limiting where the connector is going to be operating when we look at the session that we do next time, which is to be able to create new accounts. Right. So in this case, in my test AD, this is my base DN. Okay, and then there's an AD password filter. And again, for what we're doing today, this doesn't matter that much, right? So let's establish this connection, and I think we're going to be good to go. Right. So at this point, we should have a connection. There is one nuance that happens from time to time, and the connector can sometimes lose. It may lose contact with your directory, and so an easy solution to that, and it basically losing a connection, it throws people off at times. So an easy thing to do is just to come back here and kind of save the connector setting. It basically reestablishes the connection with the connector and the message bus. And if everything is okay, we should come back to the here, and we should see that this is active and we're good to go. Okay. So one more thing which I forgot to point out is in the actions, we need to make sure that this active checkbox is enabled. If this is not, then the connector is basically, it's been configured, but it's not going to do anything. It's basically like disabling the connector setting, right? So this is something which you should do as well. Okay? So now that we have our managed system information in place, we're connected. Let's take a look at our Active Directory. So we have some very simple data here, right? So if we open up our AD, I have an IAM test OU. So I basically created a test OU where I can, do all the stuff that we want to do, for our session here. And then, in there's a groups OU, and then there's a users OU, right? And then there's some test users in each one. Okay, so there's a question here. Is there a way to control the loss of connectivity? So in the issue with the connection really only seems to happen, during it's more of a problem during a fresh install. So it happens more on the first time. It doesn't really happen, on an ongoing basis. And we're working on making some improvements that will resolve that, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind. In a production setting, though, we can configure that you'll see that there's a health check going on here. If we look over here, that there is a health check that's going on with the connector. So this is saying that the connector is up, the connection is good. If this was not, this would be broken and this would be in red, right? We can also configure this so that if the connection goes down, that we can kick off an alert and let someone know that there's a problem. We will be putting out some docs in the near future, which will show you how to configure this in a more high availability setting in a production environment where you can have both multiple, sorry, more than one connector pointing to your instances. So for example, if one connector goes down, the second one will continue to work. And basically when it comes back up, to reconnect and to continue to process the activity. There's another question, which is there any kind of logging that can help us identify a connection issue? So when a connection breaks, you will see this in two areas. One is in the OpenIAM audit log viewer. And we'll take a look at that and also some of the errors that we'll see. And then you can also look at the connector logs, and I'll show you that in a second as well, as we get a little bit deeper into this in the next few minutes. Okay. So we have here basically the IAM test OU, and we have a couple of users, right? So let's go back to our to our managed system, right? So what we did was we configured so far the connection. The next thing that we need to do is configure a synchronization endpoint, right? So here, we have a couple of examples out of the box already. And when you're new to this, I would strongly recommend that you use the out of the box default configurations and modify them versus doing your own, because I've seen so many times that people just say, well, I'm going to create my own and it looks easy enough, and it is, but then you have a small mistake and it doesn't work, and then it frustrates people, right? So take a small step, use what we already created, modify it, achieve success, and then build your own from there, right? So let's take the group synchronization. And so here, we'll see a number of things on screen, right? But let's go back to our PowerPoint for a second, and we'll look at the next slide here, which is the synchronization part, right? So here, our goal is to define a few things. One is to be able to, what type of object do we want to sync, right? And I'll show you in a second that there's flexibility here. We can import users, groups, roles, organizations, even resources, other kinds of data that you have. We can bring it in. So basically, this maps the kind of objects that we have in the access control model, right? Then we also need to, tell it what connector to use, right? Because here we're just talking about the AD connector, but it really could have been any connector, or it could have even been like a CSV file, right? The next one is the groovy script, which gets a little bit more complicated, but that groovy script really is just taking data that came in from your system and mapping into objects which OpenIAM understands. And then the other part are the matching attributes. Basically, how do you take the data coming in and say that this is the record I need to update? Like, how do you know when to do a new operation versus an update or a terminate operation, right? And the filter is really about what to limit in terms of the data that we're pulling in, right? And the scripts, which we're going to control how many attributes, which attributes we can see, right? So that's the goal. So let's go and come back to our script here, right? So the question is, what is the sync cycle or interval by default? So by default, there is no automatic sync cycle. You need to define a cron expression that will define that. So, and it's done with that intentionally so that it doesn't just keep looping automatically. And people start wondering, why is this new system out there just randomly going out and looking, for data and syncing, right? So by default, there is no automatic sync cycle, and you can just do a sync now. But so here, just going back to our screen, here's, just basically give it a description, a number of threads. And when we're just getting started, leave this at one. It just means that there's one thread, working. But if you're working with a large data set, like let's say you have tens of thousands of objects or maybe hundreds of thousands of objects, and you want to make it go a little bit faster, right? So we can bump this up to 2, 3, 4, threads that you want to. And so we can have some more parallel activity happening. Be careful of what you do with this, because if you have a whole bunch of sync operations, which are opening up a whole bunch of threads, it can have a performance implication on the overall system in terms of how users are kind of feeling when they respond with it, right? So use this with a little bit of care. If you're not sure, leave it at one, and then you can always optimize it from there, right? Next part is the connector, right? So we're using our AD PowerShell connector, and we're going to sync groups. And this is going back to the sync cycle, which the question was about. So do I do a complete or an incremental sync? A complete sync is all the data that the filter is going to pull back. And a incremental sync is using, for often like the last change time, right? So things that happen after the system ran last time. And it's going to do a delta, right? So if you have a large, so the question is, can we sync in OU? Absolutely. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. Okay. So we have, the execution time, right? And this we can define as a cron expression, right? So, there's plenty of documentation online about how to define a cron expression, and you can use that to define your sync cycle, right? So if you want it to be every 15 minutes, you can do that. If you want it to be once a day, you can do that as well. If you want it to be once a week, so be it, right? It's up to you to define that in a cron expression. Okay. And then now you're going to see a bunch of things about scripts. So the pre and post processor, don't worry about it for now. We're going to come back to this. And when we look at the joiners, movers, leavers process, we'll go into this a lot more detail. Right now, just consider them as basically added flexibility into the framework of what we can do. Then we have validation rules and transformation rules. Validation rules basically are there to validate the data. We can have some rules in Groovy script, and then the other part is to be able to the transforming is basically mapping the data into what OpenIAM understands. So there's a question was, can we achieve the same configuration through a command line? At this point, no. See, the configuration's it needs to end up in the OpenIAM database one way or the other. So whether you use the REST interface or the UI, it needs to end up in the OpenIAM interface, and then it can run. So if we wanted to do this through a command line, then we would basically need to basically build a more elaborate operation, right, to be able to use, we're going to wrap around the REST API to be able to do that. For most of our customers, it's been easier for them to work with the UI than to give them more of a command line interface. And I know for a certain group of users that feel very comfortable, but then there's another element of users that we have where the learning curve would just be pretty steep, which is kind of why we've really focused more on using the user interface to be able to do this. But if it's something that you need to automate, we can take that offline, and we can, certainly help you with, different options around that. Okay, so next thing that we need to do is we define these scripts, and the scripts, we can edit them. We can go to the, and we'll take a look at that if we have some time at the end. And the next part is we, again, have a name attribute, which is going to be using the match. So for groups, we're going to be using names. For users, we're probably going to be using same account name. And then here we define our search criteria. So if you look at these commands, so things like all of these operations especially with the AD, AD connector, they're using the PowerShell commandlets internally. So it's AD get group or AD get user or AD get, I think it's company. And then we can pass in the parameters which those commandlets, provide. So in this case, we're using the group object. We're using, a dash filter, which means, give us everything. And then we can do a search. And this is the OU. So the question that was asked a second ago, can you sync an OU? Yes, you can. All you need to do is define the path to that OU that you want to sync. And this is how you can do that. Now, properties is saying that which attributes in AD for each record do we want to bring back? Now, here I've been pretty lazy and I've just put in an asterisk, which says, give me back everything. And again, for a small POC test, this is fine. But when you do a slash dash property, there is a performance implication to this. So it's better to actually spell out the properties that we are going to be syncing and then run it that way, right? So again, going back to our PowerPoint here, we have a little bit more detail around this. So again, this is the commandlets that we're using. And by default, these are the attributes that for users that we're going to bring in. For groups, there's another default set in our documentation. And then there are different operations, right? So for example, if we're going to do a group here, we're going to say get user, and we're going to provide a search. And then over here, we see that we are, having a more specific, filter. We're saying just give us all the security groups, but for the properties, just add CN and when created on top of the default list, right? So, we can kind of, we can pass in a fair amount of information into the search filter to really give us what we want. When you're testing, we often recommend just try to sync back one user or one group, show that it works, and then you can just update your filter, right, and search that way. So let's, can you sync multiple OUs? Yes, you can. You just need to basically define that in the search, in the search DN. Also, the OU that you define, that's going to it's gonna do a search internally, right? So if there's a deep hierarchy, then the system will also basically navigate through that OU structure to bring back all the objects which are there, right? So let's save this. Our sync has been saved, and let's do a sync. Okay, let's do a sync now. And this is going to go through and it's going to create a few objects, right? Okay. So the next thing is if we look at our access control and we look at our group memberships, we will see that there are a couple of groups that were created. These were the two groups that I had in my OU, right? And again, we're pulling back very little information. And we have our DN that's been defined here as well, right? So the groups now exist in OpenIAM. And again, in practice, we would do a little bit more where we would kind of define, the classifications and the group types and things like that, right? So, and as we progress, we will kind of lock down these scripts to kind of have the additional information that we want. Okay. The next thing that we need to do is we need to do the same thing with the users. So again, let's go through our user PowerShell script. Okay. And here we have users, again, same details, right? Now there's one more flag here, a couple of options here which we didn't really talk about earlier. There's a checkbox called detect orphans. Or detecting orphans, when you're just getting started like this, it's not really your primary focus. But when you're building out a full solution, what this will do is that it will compare the data that's coming from your system that you're bringing in with the data that's already in OpenIAM, which is often it should be your data from your HR system, right? So that's your baseline of the users that you have. So when we turn on the flag to detect orphans, it's going to find all the records which didn't find a match, right? So that matching attribute, like the same account name, it will get tagged as an orphan and it will put in a separate bucket. these are basically accounts that are sitting in your AD which don't have a parent. So one of two things should happen at that point. You should either fix those users, either through OpenIAM or through an AD, to give it the right parent, or you need to get rid of those because you basically have a security risk on your hand because those accounts are sitting there, being as basically orphans, right? The other part is to provision the target systems. So this is something that we'll look at next week when we do the full joiners movers leavers process, where when we have data coming in from our HR and we turn on this flag, it will allow the workflow to go downstream to be able to provision into your downstream systems. Okay. So looking at our configuration here, I think most of this looks correct. We have our SAM account name and so on and so forth, right? So, and we can save this. And now let's go ahead and do a sync now from here as well. And at this point, within a few seconds, we should be able to come in here and look for our users, right? So we have the users that we created in our AD, and the attributes that were basically mapped over from this, right? So again, this is an account that's been created in OpenIAM, and again, we should go a little bit deeper on our scripts to so this question here, is there anything like ID fix that can be used for identifying and validating that the account properties of the configuration is supported by OpenIAM? I'm not sure if I completely follow the question. If, in terms of the properties which are being supported, can you share a little bit more detail in terms of an example what you may have? And the reason I'm saying that is because we're not limited by the core attributes. Okay, so the question is whether it's a valid ID or it's an orphan. So in the matching that you do in the synchronization, you are doing a lookup to see if the ID is valid or not, right? So that's one thing. If you want to make a call out to an external system, that's where the flexibility of the Groovy scripts come in. So you can really add in all sorts of logic. So if you're thinking about doing, some kind of, simple identity proofing to kind of validate that these identities are real and go beyond the data that's in OpenIAM, then you can certainly introduce that kind of capability into those scripts to do that kind of work if you want to. So yeah, you can, there's a lot of flexibility in there if you need to kind of go down that path. Yeah. Okay, so the user's been created, and we have some very minimal attributes, and we can come here, right? So at this point, a couple of things that we can look at in terms of being able to kind of troubleshoot. So one of the things that I said was we have a log viewer, and so we can go to the log viewer and we can we can do a search, right? So in this case, I'm just having it do a dump, and so what you can see is you can see the synchronization that it ran each time that when I modified the configuration, when synchronization ran, and when it called the search, right? So if I were to open this up, so here it says it did a search on this user. It found 5 records, which is correct, and and so so this process has been started, right? And in a second, I will see additional details in these logs coming through, which will allow me to kind of see the users that were pulled in as well, right? So if I look at the synchronization, the thread, right? Each one of the users, so you see Patrick, Michael, Mike, Rafa Nadal, Roger Federer, and Alex Testis, right? So all of these were brought in, right? So when we're troubleshooting, this is something that you'll see, right? Now, somebody asked earlier about being able to troubleshoot through the logs, right? So when I was working with this yesterday and I had a mistake somewhere, in some of these cases, they were basically errors that were there. And these logs showed that there were errors, and I could see the details of those error messages as well, right? There's one more area where you can look at, and this is on the connector side. So let's go back to our Windows machine. And I said earlier on that you can use LinkPad. So let's bring up LinkPad and let's minimize some of these things. So we can do a add connection. We can use default sync here. And we're going to use SQL 4.0, and we're going to do attach a database. And we're going to browse, and let's go to so here it's filtering, and I don't want it to filter so much. It's the log DB that I want. Okay. So this is connected. And so now I can actually run normal SQL operations. So I can say, SQL, right? And there's really nothing there because everything has been working fine, right? But had there, and now if I turn if I put the connector into a debug mode, then it'd be a very verbose set of logging that goes on for every single step. And the place to do that is we need to come here and go back to our config file like we were talking about early on. So log level can go to 0. And if we want to turn on the simulation mode, we can set this to true, right? And this will, instead of sending data to AD, it will then send it to a JSON file, which you can look at. So that's basically the overall gist of it. So the two main things to look at are your connector logs, and then also to look at your OpenIAM audit logs as well, right? And so that's it for today's session. We've basically gotten ourselves connected to Active Directory. Next time we will basically build on this, and we will talk about being able to provision users into Active Directory, do your group memberships, assign, various attributes, right? Your organizations and groups, and control the OU memberships as well, right? If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, thank you very much for, okay. It's a question that where can we access the recordings? So we actually just published the first video to YouTube yesterday, and there's a playlist out there. So our plan is to get this one up there later today, and then we'll send out a link to everybody who is registered, and it will have the link to the playlist as well, and also to the PowerPoints that we're using for this. So you should have both later on today or by tomorrow morning. Okay. And thanks everybody for making the time for this, and we will see you. We'll see you on Thursday. Okay. Thanks again. So there's another question here about whether OpenIAM integrates with applications that don't have a connector. Yes, it does. And so the way we do that is using the CSV files. And we'll actually work that into the next session of how we can onboard those applications, because it's really a critical part of the whole governance piece. So we'll get that in in the next session as well. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you making the time. See you next time.